Good evening, boys and girls. Mr. Powell here again. We're going to do a little Civil War action. I'm going to talk about the state of Virginia a little bit and some of the stuff that's going on in Virginia after 1861 into the early stages of 1862 with the war. And to do that, I don't think we can really skip a couple of personalities and a couple of geographical realities of both the state and some of the people that are involved that are going on here. So first, we got to talk about this guy named George McClellan. He takes over the army after the Union Army after the defeat at Manassas, or First Bull Run, sometimes it's called, depending on if you're from the South. They always call it Manassas. People up north call it Bull Run, but either way, it was a defeat for the Union forces of the North. So anyway, the general gets fired. His name was Irvin McDowell. President Lincoln fired him. He hires this new guy named George McClellan. He's kind of a young general, sort of a hotshot guy, kind of a good-looking guy. A lot of things really came easy to him in life with school, and he was popular and all kinds of stuff like that. So just to give you evidence of that, he's sort of from the Philadelphia area. He went to University of Pennsylvania for a while. He was in Penn at, I believe, 15 years old. It's a pretty big deal. I mean, Penn's an Ivy League school. It's very tough to get into. But he was in there at 15, and he left and went to West Point, or the United States Military Academy, after that. And even there, he was a younger guy, but he was killing it in school. He just did great in school, popular, excelled at everything, and had a pretty good military career after that. But as of 1862, he's now the leader in charge of the whole Union Army, definitely over on the East Coast anyway, or the Army of the Potomac, I should say. Army of the Potomac is up here. That is the Union's East Coast Army, right? So now he's in charge, and is he going to do a good job? Well, kind of depends on who you ask. It turns out he was really, really talented at organizing the army, training the army to fight, drilling them, making them feel like they were soldiers and that they were part of something important. They were very much demoralized after First Bull Run. They had their heads down, and George McClellan really turned things around for the Union Army in terms of training and morale. So he ends up being very good at that, but we'll see how that kind of plays out, because he's not an aggressive general. Some generals are. They're always chomping at the bit. They're ready to go fight, even if they're not ready, and they might mess things up a little bit. But George McClellan he's not really that guy. He's a little bit more cautious. He's kind of, you could say, afraid of losing. So Abe Lincoln started putting pressure on him to use the army and get into combat. And this isn't going over real well. McClellan's not, he's kind of obstinate. He kind of wants to stay put. And compared to Lincoln, he's a very different kind of guy. We've all seen pictures of Abe Lincoln. He's sort of a tall, gangly sort of guy. He's not a real good-looking guy. And McClellan sort of had a superiority complex here. He kind of thought he was better than Lincoln. He thought he was the only guy who understood what was going on and how to win the war. And he really looked down on Abe Lincoln, which is strange to say now, in 2020 in the future, but he did. He wrote a number of letters to his wife they surfaced, and he was really insulting towards Abraham Lincoln and other people in the cabinet. But eventually he comes up with this plan to take over Richmond in the South and take over the capital of the Southern Confederacy there. So what he really wanted to do was get his army from Washington, D.C. and kind of sail down the Potomac River. It's the Potomac River right by Washington, D.C. Sail out here into the Chesapeake Bay, come through here, and this is the James River. There was a fort right there. It's called Fort Monroe. And it was a Union fort. It had been a Union fort since the beginning of the war. The Confederates couldn't take it. And they were going to land there and come up the the York James Peninsula. So right about here would be Yorktown, like from the Revolutionary War. Yorktown, where they had the big battle that ended the Revolution, was right about there on that peninsula. So it's really the same kind of ground that they're covering again. So why does he want to do that? Well, if you look at the geography of Virginia, there's a bunch of east-west flowing rivers that cut across the state like that. And there's even more in there that I didn't really get to. And it's very much an impediment to an army that's trying to go north-south if they've got to cross a bunch of east-west rivers. The Confederates can get in there, they can set up defenses along those rivers, and really make life a living hell for any army that's trying to cross those rivers under fire. Bad idea, right? So he wants to land here, move straight up the peninsula, and come in on Richmond. The James River right here is very navigable. It's very deep. So even some of these big Navy ships from the time can keep them supplied with food and ammunition and stuff like that. Or as they're sailing along, they can use their cannons and bombard the Confederate positions, and they can pretty much get just about all the way up to Richmond itself. So right there, you can just sort of hug the side of those rivers, either side really, and get pretty far inland to Virginia. So that's his plan. Abraham Lincoln doesn't really like it. He's afraid that it leaves Washington, D.C. open to be attacked by the Confederates from along there somewhere. So he convinces McClellan to leave some soldiers back, some regiments back there to defend D.C. He doesn't like dividing his forces, but grudgingly, he does okay the plan. So in spring of 1862, he does come down this way and starts executing his plan to come up the York James Peninsula there and hit Richmond. Like I said, McClellan's not a super aggressive general. He's very cautious, and he likes to make sure that all the things are in place, and he's not bold and chance taker kind of guy. And another thing that plagues him and his thought process as a commander is that he always seems to think that the Confederates have more men than they do. I had you guys do a web quest early on when we started this whole sort of internet based training or class sort of curriculum, but you can see very obviously that the North has many more people than the South, period. And he had bad intelligence, that spies, scouts, stuff like that, didn't work very well for him. So he was always convinced that he was up against greater odds than he was. As you can see, that would be something that's going to slow him down and maybe make him even more cautious. So as he's coming up here and he's pushing in towards Richmond, he's moving very slowly. And as he moves slowly, the Confederates are able to get other forces from places out here in the Shenandoah Valley or other places in Virginia, bring them down and get them in position to fight against McClellan. And they start to even up the odds a little bit. Now, as the fighting's going on, there's really many battles in this campaign. A campaign is a longer trial of arms where they're trying to accomplish a big strategic sort of gain, and battles might take place during the campaign. But during this campaign, there are many battles, and during one of them, the Confederate field commander, Joe Johnston, was shot in the foot. Joe Johnston is the commander for the Army of Northern Virginia, which is basically the Confederates' main army operating in this theater, fighting against the Army of the Potomac for the Union. He's hit in the foot, and he's got to leave the battle, and they need a replacement general. So they get a general named Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee comes in. He was sort of like an advisor. He was an advisor to President Jefferson Davis in Richmond. So he didn't have a field command. He didn't have a bunch of soldiers that he was telling what to do and, sort of playing that chessboard type of, battle like a commander does. He's like a desk jockey kind of general. But the Confederates didn't know how good they had it. General Lee was extremely effective general. He had experience in the Mexican-American War. He was actually asked by the United States government to be the top general for the Union Army, but he was from Virginia. So basically he waited to see what his state was going to do, and his state, Virginia, went over to the Confederacy in the South. So he went over with the Confederacy in the South too. But he is a great general, and he proves it here in this campaign against McClellan. He knows that he has to get McClellan's forces away from Richmond. If he doesn't get them away from Richmond, it could be lights out for the Confederacy. So he's highly aggressive. He comes in, he launches a lot of attacks against McClellan in this whole area here over the course of several battles. He's not always effective. He doesn't win overwhelming victories every time, but he just keeps coming. And if you put that sort of mentality up against McClellan's very cautious mentality, where he thinks he's outgunned constantly, you're going to get a good result for the South anyway. And that's eventually what happened. He starts to push McClellan out slowly but surely, and McClellan starts moving down towards the end of the York-James Peninsula here. And Lee's ultimately successful in getting those forces away from Richmond. He wasn't able to surround and capture and destroy the army, which he would have really liked, but that would have been tough. The vegetation and forest and stuff down in this area, it's very dense. There's a lot of swamps. There's a lot of other small minor rivers that run through here, and it was just something he couldn't quite accomplish. But McClellan's going to have to get his guys out and send them back up towards DC. He kind of his star's not quite so shiny anymore with the conclusion of this battle. He's looked down on by the administration of President Lincoln. Now, I mentioned this is the Virginia, or the East Coast theater of the war. This is, I guess, the quote unquote main theater of the war, with Richmond being right here. DC is the capital of the United States right here. They're only about 90 miles apart. There's going to be a lot of fighting in there. It's not the only theater of the war, but it's the one that got the most press and the most people wrote about it and everything else, just because of where it was. This Shenandoah Valley right here, over in what they call the Blue Ridge Mountains, down there in the south, as it comes up towards here, there's Maryland, Pennsylvania will be up here off the map. As it gets up to Pennsylvania, this is the Poconos. This is that north-south mountain range that runs, through Pennsylvania, but also Virginia and West Virginia. But this Shenandoah Valley is sort of like a gap between some of the mountain range there. And it's very lush, very fertile, with small farms, produces lots of crops to eat, and pork and all kinds of other stuff that people want to eat and consume and everything. But this becomes a theater of the war too. So this is sort of a minor theater of the war. And then if I get the big map out that I had the other day, which I luckily didn't erase here, that kind of thing, hopefully. All right, but if you look at the big map here, so there's Virginia, and the Shenandoah Valley would be this little sliver right here. But there's also the Western Theater, which we're going to look at more next time I talk to you guys. The Western Theater out here with Kentucky and Tennessee, Mississippi and all that. That's also a theater of the war. Then there's the Trans-Mississippi Theater over here. There's not as much going on out there. Historically, there's fewer numbers of people and not as many huge battles, but there were definitely battles, plenty. And then I guess maybe you could say the naval or maritime theater of the war, which is the naval gunboats going at each other. Here the Union had a decided advantage, but they had a huge scare here in the opening stages of this Peninsular campaign that I had you guys read about. But active in this area is one of the world's first ever ironclad battleships. Hitherto everything was wood and sail. So I think I showed you guys a clip of Master and Commander back in the days when we were doing the Revolution. So, you know, you can get kind of a visual idea. But the new ships that are the new ships of the line that are going to be the top battleships are going to be encased in metal. So the Southerners had one of the first ever, right? It's called the Merrimack, or the USS Virginia, right? That's a Southern name, and it was operational down here, and it fought the very first ironclad battle against a ship called the Monitor, which was from the north, which came down, and they just slugged it out. And like I said, they're encased in iron, so neither one of them sank in that battle. But eventually, the Union forces caught up to the the CSS Virginia, and the Confederates sunk it rather than let it fall into Union hands. But that's another theater of the war that can't be ignored, and it's part of that Union Anaconda plan. Well, that's enough for tonight. I'll get some stuff out for you guys next time we go here, and stay healthy and make sure you're reading some books and getting some exercise and doing good things. All right, thanks. Bye-bye.